So good afternoon everybody, thank you for coming. Our last two lectures are two totally different topics to the first two, and we're going to be talking about Spanish history since 1930 and maybe on some of the trips in Bilbao and in La Coruña, references made to the Spanish history and the Civil War and so forth, and hopefully today I'll fill you in a little bit in the background. So, this first picture is entitled The Death of a Militiaman, and it was photographed by a young Hungarian photographer who wanted to make his name in wartime photography. And he came from Budapest, he was Hungarian, and he came with his girlfriend to Paris, and they got a contract with Paris Match, which was a sort of photographic magazine, a bit like Picture Post, and he went off to Spain to get war photographs. He had his Leica camera, and she had a twin lens Rolleiflex. You may remember these cameras we used to have in those days. And in fact, the particular picture became iconic, really, as far as the Civil War is concerned, although I understand it was actually staged. It was a stage photograph taken in September 36 near Cordoba. So many of the books and so on have that particular photograph in it. So back to 1930. This guy, General Miguel Primo de Rivera, had been a dictator for 7 years. The Cortes was dissolved, he agreed with the king to become a dictator, and he ran the country relatively well, though if you didn't agree with what he did, you might get banished. But other than that, things went along quite nicely. But in 1929 we had the Wall Street crash, and then the Depression followed, and things started going downhill, and so he resigned. And at the same time, the king also resigned. This is his family, and there are a couple of people who are important referred to. Jose Antonio here, who comes up, and his daughter here, Pilar, she comes up in the lecture I give tomorrow. So this was their family. And by 1930, Franco was a senior general, and he earned his spurs, as it were, in a colonial war in Spanish Morocco. The king, Alfonso XIII, he actually abdicated when Primo retired, and so the way was then open to form a republic. There'd been a lot of agitation that they needed a democratic republic. They didn't want this dictatorship anymore. And so in 1931, the Second Republic was established, and this, after an election, was a centre-left government, and it was a coalition. The trouble with the Spanish character seems to be they have great difficulty in forming coalitions. They've all got their own agenda, and this will appear in today's talk and tomorrow quite frequently. And it certainly did with this Republican government, because it was a coalition of Republicans, Socialists, but they wrote a new constitution, and they were taking on three very important power blocks, as it were. They were taking on the army, the church, and the oligarchy, who more or less owned everything. Big landowners, industrialists, and so forth. And the army, first of all, had 200,000 men, but 200 plus generals. And when they were told too many generals, they said the problem was we haven't got enough soldiers. So that, you know, they got nowhere with that. And there were a lot of officers as well, as you can see. The church was very wealthy, with little contact or understanding of life of the poor. The typical situation was there'd be a beggar on the street, the priest would walk past, and he would say, "Have patience, brother, you will be rewarded in the hereafter." Church very good at selling the hereafter. There were 35,000 priests, 20,000 monks, and 60,000 nuns. And the church was actually established, and it received funds from the state. But a very low attendance. But it had a huge influence in education. All education was controlled by the Catholic Church. The oligarchy, they owned all the land, and they controlled the civil service, the banks, and major industry. New government policy was to disestablish the Catholic Church, to require a vow of loyalty to the Republic. And it appears that the Jesuits, who were a big factor in the Catholic Church at this time and did most of the education, they have a vow to the Pope, and that was regarded as being not loyal to Spain. It was disloyal, and so they had to go. Religious education to cease, church schools to close. Divorce and civil marriage established. There's no divorce and no civil marriage. Reform of the army, too many generals, the closure of Zaragoza Academy. Now this was really an upsetting to Franco, because he had been instrumental in creating this economy in the 1920s under the dictatorship. It was equivalent really to Sandhurst in the British Army. Land reform. Land was a big problem because you had these huge areas controlled by one or two families, and they owned vast acres. They had tenant farmers who had no security and could be dismissed more or less on a whim. And then the workforce was absolutely casual. So if you needed somebody to pick your olives, you just recruited people at the gate on a day rate basis. And if the workers didn't think they got enough money and they went on strike, then they simply import people from other parts of Spain who had even less money. And so rural poverty was a real problem at this time. Female rights, including the vote, a devolution for Catalonia and for the Basque state, but particularly Catalonia, an issue which is current in Spain today. The main leader of this Republican government was Manuel Azana. He was an academic, but he went into politics and did what he thought was the best for the country. Unions and other working class groupings. Now, the Socialist Party, PSOE, the Party Socialist Workers of Spain, that still exists today. Unions, this is a general union of workers, more like our old Transport General Workers Union. Anarchists. Now, anarchists were very influential at this time. They were against everything. They were against the set-up, property is theft, is their sort of motto. And you can see what they wanted, because that's one of their posters, with everybody with rifles firing out, trying to get rid of any opposition. So we had two groups of anarchists, CNT and FAI. And then there was another group of Marxists who weren't communists. They were against the Russian Soviet system. They were Marxists, more like Trotskyites perhaps, and they were known as the Party of Workers of Marxist Unification. And when George Orwell went to Spain, I'll say a bit more about him later on, he joined this party and he thought they were the more represented his thoughts at the time. And of course when they went to war, none of them had any training, but he of course went to Eton, so he'd been in the Corps at Eton, so he knew a little bit about infantry warfare, which none of the others did. And if you read his book I'll refer to later, this comes up. In this war, colonial war in Morocco, this went on for about 15 years. It was very unpopular. There was a draft every year, and they were fighting the local people, the Arabs and the Moors living in Spanish Morocco. And when the going got tougher then, they simply skipped over the border into French Morocco. And it was only in 1925 that this war was finally concluded, and the general in charge at the time was Jose Sojourno, known as the Lion of the Rif. The Rif is the line of mountains down the middle of the country. And after this new government had come in 1932, he tried to overturn it. And this is known as a pronunciamiento in Spanish. It's a coup to us. And but he was betrayed, apparently, by a prostitute, which goes to show you have to be very careful with your pillow talk. Anyway, he was arrested and he was banished to what was Spanish Sahara, which is an area in Africa just opposite the Canaries. He comes up a bit later. So this is Spanish Morocco here, and you've got this line of hills here, the Rif. And this was a colony in the north of this is French Morocco down here. In 1932, there was a revolt in a small village in Andalusia, Castelblanco, and in fighting with the Guardia Civil, there were casualties. Eventually the revolt was crushed rather brutally and the coalition government fell. Now just a few words about the Guardia Civil. They are a military police force which still exists in some parts of Spain, and they were created in the 1830s because after the Peninsular War, a lot of the people the guerrillas who'd been fighting the French occupiers, they liked being guerrillas and bandits, and they carried on being bandits. And it was pretty chaotic in the countryside, so the government decided to create this Guardia Civil, a military police force, to try and control the countryside. And that existed right the way through. And it became important in the Civil War. In 1933 there was an election, and women had the vote this time, and the women apparently, they reckon, voted to the right. They wanted things not to change, and so a right-wing government. So we had a move over from left to right. And